To the children whose birth water is broken by whizzing of shrapnel, this is our portion. We know war in sunken eyes. We know it in the jabbing hunger pains. We know it in our heavily blistered, callous feet. Home is living between two tectonic plates, deep orange skies that invite birds that squat, scrap, and scavenge. The blood has made it to the groundwater. There is time to perish, but there is no time to mourn. There is time to rot, but there is no time to bury. Home is suspicion. Home is crouch face down on cement pavement. What is sanctum on unceded land? We say we have survived. To fathers that sleep with guns in their hands but would never hold their children, legacy does not fill the gaps. You've turned our names to weights that crush our backs. You've turned our names into sinking sand. What are hunger pains to torn limbs? What is plumbing to broken spirits? What are roots if they choke you? We say home is so far. The same oceans are sitting between folks looking into each other's eyes. Our portion is silence. They imagine home is settled soot. They imagine country is running. We now know refuge is both.
Welcome to this Geneva Peace Week. The subject for our conversation today is about addressing root causes of forced displacement. So I'd like to begin by just making a few remarks myself before I pass over to my very distinguished colleagues here to discuss this key question of addressing the root causes of forced displacement. And the question I ask myself is, well, why is this so important to UNHCR and to all of our partners? And it seems to me that the numbers provide a compelling answer. For today, about 1% of all humanity now lives in exile, forcibly displaced from their homes and seeking protection in their own country or across borders with neighbouring countries. UNHCR reported that for last year, about 80 million people were forcibly displaced globally, and the number is sadly growing again this year, as indeed it has done for every year over the last 20 years. So the next question then is, well, they're big numbers, but why are so many displaced? And the answer, of course, lies with conflict and displacement being increasingly intertwined and linked to other drivers of instability. The root causes of conflict are to be found in ethnic, religious, cultural discord, deep inequalities, especially gender inequalities, discrimination, marginalization within societies, weak or even corrupt governance, poverty, and increasingly climate and environmental degradation. Well, UNHCR has a long 70-year history of responding to emergencies, including, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. And an example I like to quote is, we respond on the ground. Our High Commissioner has asked us to stand and deliver. And just as an almost banal example, we have provided a million bars of soap to the Sahel region over the last few months. But the protracted nature of conflict and the growing number displaced have created what really is an unsustainable demand for protection that simply can't be met. We have the Rohingya crisis with about 850,000 refugees fleeing Myanmar over the last 3 years and, of course, for many years before. Afghanistan, a war that's been protracted for 40 years, Syria for 10 years. We have many millions leaving Venezuela, being hosted in parts of North Central America. Intercommunal conflict in the Sahel and the Lake Chad regions. And, of course, an acute humanitarian crisis in Yemen, with, again, huge numbers of peoples displaced. An unresolved political and military post-conflict crises in Rwanda and Burundi, and the wars in the 90s in the Balkans. Well, these intractable and lengthy conflicts, leading to the displacement of millions, has prompted a growing understanding that we need to move from ad hoc emergency and humanitarian relief, which of course we'll continue to do, to sustainable prevention. In short, we need some refreshed thinking and some new ideas. And some creative thinking has led to the Global Compact of 2018, 2 years ago. 181 nations agreed to share responsibilities for refugees and those forcibly displaced or stateless. And the agreement was given practical effect in December last year in the Global Refugee Forum, which generated 1,400 pledges and commitments, aiming to do something about the drivers of conflict and instability and to embark on deeper efforts for sustainable peace. Well, there are some encouraging developments that give us some hope. The signing of the Juba Peace Agreement, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that in a few minutes, between Sudan's transitional government and the Sudan Revolutionary Front and others. And we have a revitalised agreement on the resolution of conflict in South Sudan. We have renewed peace efforts in the Central African Republic and the African Union acting as a guarantor of the political settlement. And working at the community level, faith-based actors support efforts to assist refugees at the local level. They are often first responders. They know what's going on in their communities. And recently, the High Commissioner for Refugees agreed with a group called Religions for Peace, a peak body, to establish a multi-religious council for religious leaders to help examine root causes. Another important means of peace building is the inclusion of women, and I'm sure that Susie will be telling us more about this. But it is extraordinary to understand that COVID-19 has put yet another spotlight on the disproportionate impact of women and girls on conflict and displacement. They're exposed to sexual exploitation and violence, girls being offered in early marriage or subject to other abuses. But sadly, women are rarely involved in decision-making or peace building. While globally, women comprise 13% of peace negotiators, 3% of mediators and 4% of signatories, women in fact are excellent leaders in brokering peace and ensuring peace at the local level. And there are many successful models that where you include women in peace building, you have a much better chance of achieving a sustainable and long-term peace. There are examples in Sudan, but also the Central African Republic, where for the first time in the history of that country, women participated in the Khartoum peace talks, and one woman was in fact a signatory to the agreement. And I'd like to mention, if I may, in the context of Mali, the important role of women leaders working across political lines and playing a key role in transition. And I'd like to congratulate Mrs. Bintou Funes Samake on her recent appointment in the cabinet as Minister for Women, Children and Family Affairs. And there are other models, roles with parliamentarians who are key players in achieving peace. And the African Regional Parliamentary Conference last year particularly recognised that good governance, the observance of the rule of law and respect for the human rights are the best possible forms of conflict prevention and displacement. Well, what role has UNHCR been playing in these peace-building efforts? We have, of recent times, been focusing much more on the community and local protection to find long-term solutions on a do-no-harm basis. We've recognised that communities are best placed to contribute to peace and to deal with the root causes of conflict. And there are many, many examples. For example, in Honduras, the United Nations Refugee Agency is collaborating with government, with Caritas and with local parishes to introduce digital technology to document the housing and land that people abandon when they flee violence and organised crime. That way you can strengthen the National Property Register, reduce violations of property rights, and hopefully enable a peaceful return to those who've been displaced. Another example is UNDP working with IOM and through our own agency in the Burundi-Tanzania cross-border project, 19, that provided refugees and those internally displaced with assistance for voluntary repatriation and integration. But in summary, at UNHCR, we're convinced that a political and peace process that includes displaced people will reduce the risk of future instability, conflict and displacement. The participation of those forcibly displaced in national elections is an important step towards political reconciliation and, of course, a fundamental human right. Well, those are just some words from me. I'd now like to hear, and I'm sure you all will want to hear, some voices from very different countries and operations in support of the peace process. And I'd like to invite, if I may, Ambassador Abdellatif, and we particularly welcome, if I may say, in inviting him to speak, Egypt's pledge at the Global Refugee Forum that I've mentioned. We thank you for your country's active engagement in addressing root causes. Over to you, Ambassador.
The Aswan Forum on Sustainable Development, Peace and Security tried to change a bit the conversation around this issue by ensuring that humanitarian issues are not addressed as a standalone issue, but fully integrated with peace and security and for integrated solutions.
Has always been a priority. What has sort of shifted is saying, how do we do this in a more coherent and sustainable manner?
New initiative, starting with the Hippo panel and then coming with the secretarial reports and the resolutions, really highlights the importance of looking at structural issues for preventing conflict and for building peace.
Meaning that the access to education, access to health, access to livelihoods that includes people, especially young people, that promotes jobs, especially for young people.
Investments have been done for a number of years. Countries are still continuing either collapsing into conflict or maintaining some sort of instability.
Peace building is not really just a technical, financial and logistic issue. First and foremost, it's a political issue.
And what the Sustaining Peace agenda is really trying to promote is that this is an ongoing continuum. So breaking away from a project cycle and really integrating this into regular development work.
The people we serve, they do not make the distinction between who is a humanitarian actor, who is a development actor, and who is a peace and security actor. That distinction is only in our heads.
The first thing the conflict brings to a community, it destroys the social fabric. When people leave their communities to become IDPs or refugees, they leave behind a vacuum, a distorted, destroyed social fabric that needs to be repaired. And peace is needed where they left, and peace is needed where they are.
The African Union has designated 2019 as the year of refugees and displaced persons. So it was very naturally, when going towards this forum, that the issues of forced displacement tabled themselves naturally in the agenda very strongly, bearing in mind also some of the situation in Africa in terms of forced displacement. You mentioned some numbers. Africa hosts a third of all refugees globally. The numbers of refugees have increased very significantly over the past years, tripling in the past decade. Egypt itself, my own country, is a host to around 5 million migrants who are very much in almost refugee-like situations. And looking at the root causes of displacement, of all these problems, conflict come up primarily. And the Aswan Forum came up with a very strong message on the need to ensure that we really address forced displacement through the peace continuum, going from a strong emphasis on conflict prevention to peace building to post-conflict reconstruction, and through all these cycles, and not just at one of them. With COVID-19, the situation is further complicated and further aggravated for migrants and refugees, and we need to make sure that they are fully integrated in the recovery packages, in the efforts to rebuild better towards post-COVID recovery, using a holistic and integrated approach that emphasizes interconnectedness and dealing with the complexity of these issues in an inclusive way.
Now I'd like to invite the Deputy Director, Mr. George Conway from the Crisis Bureau, to tell us a little bit about the role that development actors can play in addressing root causes of forced displacement. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. And let me start just with framing with four overarching points as it relates to developmental solutions to forced displacement. The first is, we need to put this into a developmental frame. We have committed collectively under the Sustainable Development Goals in the 2030 Agenda to end extreme poverty by 2030. We have committed to a series of benchmarks to advance a collective developmental agenda that is and continues to be actively undermined by the realities of conflict and crisis across the world. And when you take the various compounded risks and threats that many people in many countries face, whether they relate to the climate emergency, whether they relate to insecurity, certainly mapping the impacts of COVID on top of that, the scene is quite worrisome looking ahead. And this is the first year since UNDP started tracking the Human Development Index some 30 years ago. This is the first year in which we're seeing a decline and a regression on the Human Development Index. And of course, those that are most impacted by this are those in situations of either forced or protracted displacement. And this leads to my second point, which is that those that find themselves having to move either to access better security or to access life-saving humanitarian support are almost always those that are most excluded, those that are most vulnerable and suffering from the most extreme inequalities in their countries, in their societies. And we must have a developmental optic on why it is that certain parts of populations are subjected to such extreme marginalization and vulnerability, but that they have no choice but to move in order to seek better lives and better support. And this often relates to deeply and structural exclusions and inequalities built into societies and how they operate, and how economies function and how social support networks function in the absence of social protective environments and policies. And really does require a thorough understanding and analysis at a country by country level to understand why these types of exclusions are happening that create situations of vulnerability that lead to situations of people having to move in ways that put themselves at even greater risk. Third point, most displacement these days is caused by a combination of factors, whether it's the impacts of the climate crisis, its impacts on recurrent natural hazards like floods and droughts, combined with the impacts of insecurity and conflict. Having just come from a long stint in Somalia, it's very clear watching how the cycles of drought and floods intersect with a certain baseline in the countryside of vulnerability, of insecurity, in ways that compel people to move from rural to urban areas in the context of trying to address the impacts of natural hazards, and to move away from very overt security threats that they face. And increasingly, we need to look at how these different types of risks are compounded, how they intersect with each other and reinforce each other in ways that are deeply troubling and need more comprehensive solutions that address issues around climate change adaptation together with building local capacities for peace. We're far beyond the days that we can look at these issues in isolation and in a siloed manner, and that calls for joined up integrated approaches from humanitarian development and peacebuilding actors. A next point is, and really the purpose of this discussion is the need for a collective pivot to prevention. We spend most of our collective resources, we spend most of our collective attention focusing on the consequences of displacement once it happens, rather than investing more proactively in trying to address structural underlying causes of why it is that people have the need to move. And the Secretary General has called for a new prevention agenda, lots of good traction internationally on the Sustaining Peace agenda. we need to change not just the narrative, but the ways that we actually work in countries that experience a crisis, fragility, the impacts of the climate crisis, in order to find the right places to make the right types of investments that can reduce chronic inequalities, that can create better protective environments for people through introduction of social protection frameworks, to strengthen local capacities for peace in a way that we can get advance of the curve of the types of insecurity that are driving these types of forced movements in the first place.
Can we move now then to Susie Sebit, who's going to talk to us about getting women to the peace table when agreements are signed. And I know Susie, that you've personally contributed to this. I should also say that for security reasons, you've got to leave once you've made your contribution, so we won't be able to ask any more questions. But if you could tell us a little bit about what's being done to bring women in early as equal partners in addressing the root causes of displacement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate UNHCR for giving me this opportunity to echo out some of the point I have of a South Sudanese young woman who had been growing in the conflict and also experiencing the same as after we get independent, but also as a young South Sudanese woman who have a voice to echo the suffering of other women across the country. The stakeholders must acknowledge the marginalization of women. It starts before conflict and before displacement. And the majority of those affected are women and children. And this conflict and marginalizations start as a small conflict, which when unresolved, grow into political dispute, power struggle, and then escalate into massive violence, where very few women have a say, then displacement follows. When we talk about sustainable peace or sustainable development, women's voices need to be equal, not from the background, but rather to be put at the front, at the table with men as well. Also be part of the decision making, and also be part of the negotiation, the mediations, and also to be signatories to the agreement. Simply because the majority of the population affected are women. They are the one taking care of the children, they are the one taking care of the elderly, they hate families, they are sexually abused, domestic violence, and then they live in the refugees camps, they live in the protection of civilians, and also they live in the internal displaced camps across the country. That is why it is very important to bring collective voice of women from different areas, from the refugees, from the displaced, and then also from the protection of the civilian, women within the protection of civilian side. Intercommunal violence is one of the major conflict and cause of the displacement in South Sudan, as well as other parts of the world. But then those who are affected are women at the same time. But then when there is an intercommunal dialogue going on, it is very difficult to bring women voices. And the women of South Sudan in 2018 decided to be part of the peace process. And we say, nope, if we don't have our chairs, we will carry our stools and sit on the negotiation table to echo our voices and our demands. In 2018, UN Women released a report that stated that there is a likelihood of sustainability of peace agreement where women are fully represented. This is an example in South Sudan, and I'm very proud to say that the reason why South Sudan peace agreement is holding up to today is simply because women were part of the process. Women were not just at the table, behind the table, but rather they were sitting on the table in front, and they have their voices, and they also echo the voice of women in the refugees across the borders. They were able to echo the voice of the women in the protection of the civilian side across the country. They were able to echo the voices of women in different displaced camps across the country. Women from these communities also need to be represented. They were represented. Women from the refugees camp were represented. Their voices were represented. Women from the parties to the agreement were able also to echo out their voices. And this is a very important phase of peace agreement. And this is a very important phase of sustainable peace. And it is also a very important phase of stopping and bringing a sustainable development to the point that displacement and forced displacement have to stop. So it is important that not only elderly women, we have also young women, women living with disabilities. This number, these categories of women, voices are very important in the peace process. And I'm very proud to say that every peace agreement where women are part of the decision and are part of the negotiation is always sustainable. There's a likelihood of implementation. Yes, the South Sudan peace agreement is not fully implemented, but I am very proud to say that it's better than the 2015 peace agreement that broke after a few months with the State House conflict fighting. We all know that incident. That's why it is important to bring the voice of women on the negotiation table. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Susie. That was excellent. We really appreciate your making that intervention, and wonderful to see your leadership as a young woman lawyer in bringing women to the table. It will be wonderful to see some more research into just what are the ingredients that women bring to that negotiation that they then bring back to their local communities that can ensure the sustainability of that peace agreement. And the two agreements that you point to, the former one which broke down and this one which is looking much more successful, it'd be very interesting for a scholar like you and your colleagues to do some more work on what the differences are and why we must include women in these negotiations. I think it's really crucial research. And if I may say so, I'm also very pleased that you mentioned women and people who are disabled, because they are a significantly disproportionate number of those who are displaced, and we perhaps forget to include them in our thinking about displaced people. So if I may, I'd like to return to Ambassador the Ambassador to talk about a little bit more about the Aswan Forum. And I very much appreciated your point that you want that to be a conversation which will be continued in other contexts, and I hope it will be. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what you see as a key recommendation in addressing root causes, and then perhaps tell us if you've got some examples of how COVID has really affected the implementation of that Aswan Forum process. Over to you, Ambassador.
To come to another one or two other recommendations that to highlight is this issue that addressing forced displacement is a whole government, whole society endeavor. It cannot be compartmentalized. We need to address the needs of refugees and displaced persons in national development plans, in implementing the 2030 agenda. I think another aspect that has already been mentioned is making sure that the needs of displacement are an integral part of peace agreements, such as the ones we are witnessing on the continent. And then there are some other recommendations about the need to ensure that the frameworks we have in place between the humanitarian side are in sync and in synergy. For example, in Africa, we have an African peace architecture, we have an emerging humanitarian architecture, and they need to be in sync. They need to work in synergy. This issue of a message that came out quite strongly also is the need to share responsibility rather than shifting the burden. Finding comprehensive solution is, in Africa in particular, with the extent and the magnitude of the problem, is a matter of international and global interest and response and solidarity. COVID has also had the effect of, again, showing how the risks are magnified, the vulnerable are mostly impacted, and among them, of course, the people in displacement. So that is the holistic agenda also that I found in the intervention by George from UNDP and this integrated approach. And we're also very appreciative that UNDP was a strong partner of the Aswan Forum, and we share a bit kind of like an entry point to some of these issues that we hope to take forward in this kind of fully integrated continuum of interventions to address these issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. And I think this has to be a whole of society approach, and it's critical to understand that COVID has actually had, in its own rather sad way, shone a light on the fact that if you are vulnerable in a community for inequality, discrimination, displaced, you are much more likely to be vulnerable to the emergencies, whether they're environmental flooding or whether it's a health pandemic. What these events do is to show how fragile our societies are and how we need to strengthen those societies if we're to prevent this kind of huge impact on displaced people. So thank you very much, Ambassador. And I'll now move to Mr. Conway, who's going to perhaps tell us a little bit more about what specific examples UNDP has adopted to deal with root causes of displacement. And of course, investment is so critical with the financial institutions, and I'd be very interested to hear how you go about your work in dealing with these root causes.
The factors that cause forced displacement are complex, they're multifaceted, they're multi-leveled, and they need very individualized responses tailored to individual development circumstances. But, happy to look across UNDP's work and engagements on some, common themes that come out in our experience. Certainly, a first point relates to contextual analysis and understanding, and understanding what types of developmental solutions are fit for purpose in given context. And to this end, we've had a long-standing collaboration between UNDP and the Department of DPPA in the UN Secretariat on deployment of what we call peace and development advisors, who are currently serving over 80 countries globally, and working with UN resident coordinators to exactly try to understand root causes of violence, root causes of crisis, what causes people to have to move in response to certain types of circumstances, and what that means in terms of the UN's and UNDP's developmental strategies in country. It's been a good model. It's helped to take us forward in terms of helping the UN as a whole to pull together more integrated responses across the various mandates, and certainly between humanitarian development and peace building parts of the system as well. And within the frame of the advisory support of the Peace and Development Advisors, we've had very strong interaction. UNDP is the largest implementer of peace building fund projects together with other parts of the system, with UNHCR in many countries, to address exactly those types of root and underlying causes. And they're different in different places. In many cases, they deal with social and economic exclusions, marginalization, vulnerability. What does that mean then in terms of the design and delivery of social protection systems? What we've seen in the context of COVID, for example, is a lot of discussions in many developing countries around either putting in place new social protection systems and or expanding existing ones to better target those most vulnerable. And there's been quite a wave of activity here that we're very pleased to see. And so one of the key lines of support that we've been providing to program governments has been on better understanding, what types of social protection systems are fit for purpose in this existing COVID circumstance. But it's a much broader issue and addresses broader underlying vulnerabilities. Second, and this I hope very much reinforces the comments from our colleague from South Sudan, the utter importance of investing in local capacities for peace. And we have different ways of talking about this. Sometimes we talk about infrastructures for peace. Sometimes we talk about insider mediation capability. But effectively, it comes down to who are the local actors best positioned to be able to work at an intercommunity level in order to understand grievances, in order to understand the nuances of resource-based competition and conflict, in order to bring communities together for productive dialogue on how they can live in peaceful coexistence, and to support strengthening of social cohesion between communities in a way that reduces the prospects for friction in the future. And this is a widespread area of UNDP's work that we support in dozens and dozens of countries, both across the African continent and elsewhere in the world, by looking very proactively at how can we strengthen exactly the types of capacities that our South Sudanese colleague was speaking to, a women's group, women leaders. In many countries, the number of inside mediators that we support, many are women, in order to exactly find the right types of networks between communities that could have the most impactful results on trying to resolve community-based disputes. The investments, thirdly, in local governance are fundamental. We found that people are compelled to move when local governance arrangements are inadequate to their needs. When either there's a ineffective protection environment with local authorities, local rule of law infrastructures, where people do not feel secure, and or where local provision of services cannot meet their needs in response to certain types of environmental and other threats and strains. And so investing in effective local governance and keeping very localized social contracts effectively functioning is fundamental to prevent people from moving in the first place by having a secure and productive local environment in which they continue to meet their livelihood aspirations and live in safety and dignity. And finally, developmental solutions on violent extremism is something that we're focusing additionally on, understanding that there are reasons why people choose to align themselves with extremist groups. In many cases have to do with dysfunctional local governance arrangements, feelings of persecution or marginalization by local governance structures. In essence, the inefficacy of local governance arrangement that drives people to extremism. And so the more that we can support governments in order to ensure that governance systems are accountable, that they're transparent, that they're fair, that they serve the diversity of their citizens in ways that are equitable, that are inclusive, can go a long way to reduce some of the underlying drivers. I'll leave my comments there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This really has been fascinating, and perhaps I could say that another of the lessons we've learned at the UN Refugee Agency is the importance of localization. Yeah. We have been restructuring under the High Commissioner to get more of our emergency and other capacities into the local environment, and we've found that that's been enormously successful. Because local communities know what their local problems are, and they know how to find solutions. And I think we're working more and more to deliver resources at that level, and hence, of course, the agreement we have with the faith-based groups, because they stay and deliver. They don't move, and they're always there working with their communities, and they're a very important mediator for us. I very much hope that the next Aswan 2 is a success, and that we keep this discussion going, and that we keep working together, because we want integration at the local level, but we want to make sure we're all working together at the country level and through groups like UNHCR and of course UNDP. So thank you all very much.
It is time to put armed conflict on lockdown and focus together on the true fight of our lives. End the sickness of war and fight the disease that is ravaging our world.